The deck was tilted 30 degrees toward the bow, and the men stood on it in ranks. They had their muskets at the order. The colonel stood with them. He had drawn his sword. He had given the order "stand fast," and they had taken the order and stood. The boats were 30 yards off by then, and they were pulling for open water. The women in the boats did not look back. The children in the boats did not look back. The men in the boats had been told not to look back, so they did not look back. The deck went on tilting. The men on the deck went on standing. They stood until the deck broke under them, and then they stood on the part of the deck that was still there, and then there was no more deck, and they went into the sea, and most of them did not come back out of it. 445 men died that way. Every woman in the boats lived. Every child in the boats lived. This was at 2 in the morning of the 26th of February, in the year 1852, off a stretch of African coast that the charts called Danger Point. That is the whole story. The rest is only how it happened. The ship was the Birkenhead. She was iron-built, two-funneled, paddle-wheeled, and she was rigged for sail as well, on 3 masts, so she could make passage when the coal was short. She had been laid down as a frigate. They had taken the guns off and put her in service as a troopship. She was 210 feet long, and she was very fast for her time. That is how she came to be sailing south from Queenstown, in Ireland, in the January of 1852, with the soldiers and the women and the children on board. She had on her decks the men of several regiments, the 73rd Foot, the 74th Highlanders, the 91st Argylls, the 12th Lancers, bits and pieces of half a dozen others. Drafts going out to reinforce regiments already on the ground at the Cape. There were about 480 soldiers in all. There were 31 women and children, the wives and children of officers, and men who were already serving in South Africa. There was the ship's crew, about 130 more, when she sailed from Simon's Bay on the evening of February 25th for her last short run up the coast. The total was 640 souls. She was bound for Algoa Bay with the reinforcements. The army at the Cape needed them. The war had gone badly. The Xhosa had not given ground. London had sent the men they could send. They were on the Birkenhead because she was the next ship, and she was fast. She had 3 regimental colonels aboard. The senior man was Alexander Seton. He was 41 years old. He had been 23 years a soldier. He had a wife in England and a son in school. He was a quiet man. He had served in India. He read books. He was thought by the men under him to be just but distant and not unkind. He commanded the troop draft. The captain of the ship was Robert Solmond. He was 42. He had been at sea since he was 13. He had a wife and 3 children. He had been told to make the run from Simon's Bay to Algoa Bay quickly, because the troops were needed quickly. He had elected to hug the coast, inside the usual offing, because the inshore route was shorter and the weather was fair and the moon was bright. He thought he knew the coast. He had been over this stretch of it before. He was not entirely wrong. He had been over it. He did not know it as well as he thought. She sailed at 6 in the evening of the 25th, with the wind light from the northwest and the sea quiet and the moon, a thin, clean white. The men were below at their messes, the officers were at supper, the women and children were in their cabins, the watch was set. Solmond went up. He took the deck himself for the early part of the run, because the run was short and he wished to see them clear of the headlands. He stayed on deck until 11. Then he turned in. He left orders to be called if anything was seen. It was a quiet watch. The man at the wheel held her at 8.5 knots. The man on the lookout reported nothing. There was no wind to speak of. The sea was nearly flat. The moon was setting low. They were running. The ship's reckoning had it, 3 miles offshore. They were running, in fact, considerably closer. At 10 minutes before 2 in the morning, she struck. The rock she struck was an uncharted pinnacle. It rose like a single tooth from the deep water under her. She went onto it at full steam, 8.5 knots, and the rock punched through her bow on the starboard side, below the forward troop deck, and through her hull plates, and a great many men in the forward berth were drowning before the watch on deck had finished hearing the noise. Most of them did not wake. The water came in fast and cold. The lamps went out. The hatches above were not yet opened. The men who did wake had time to understand where they were and what was happening to them. And then they did not have any more time than that. They were the men who had been quartered forward because the army accommodated its privates and its junior soldiers forward. The men aft, in the cabins, lived. The men below the waterline forward, by and large, did not. The records cannot now reconstruct the precise count. The rolls did not survive in the form that would let us count it. But the survivors' accounts agree on the largest single fact of the night, which is that most of the men who died on the Birkenhead never reached the upper deck at all. They died in their bunks. The line of men who stood at attention as the ship broke was a smaller line than the troops who had sailed. That too has to be said, because the discipline of the men who stood was paid for in advance by the men who never had the chance to stand. Salmond was up at once. He came up in his nightshirt. He took the deck. He ordered the engines reversed. The engines were reversed. She came off the rock. That was the wrong order. He gave it because he was thinking like a captain whose ship is aground, not like a captain whose ship is opened. The water that had been held back by the rock now poured in. She filled fast. He understood then what he had done. He gave the next orders very quickly. Beat to quarters. Lower the boats. Get the women and the children up. Get the troops mustered on the upper deck. Cut away the horses. The horses on the troop deck were screaming. They were thrown overboard. They had to be. They would have wrecked the boats if they were lowered. They were thrown overboard and they tried to swim. The men below who could swim went after them, because a swimming horse is something a man may hold to in a sea, and 1 or 2 horses did reach the shore. The rest did not. There were 8 boats on the Birkenhead. 3 were got into the water. The other 5 were jammed. Some were jammed by the paint on the davits, which had not been worked since the ship left England. One was crushed by the funnel when it fell. One was launched and at once swamped. The boats that worked were 1 cutter and 2 paddle boxes. They were the boats in which the women and the children were put. The boats were rowed clear and held off at a little distance against the chance of being swamped by the men who would, in any other circumstances, have come for them. The men did not come for them. That is the part of it that has to be said now, before the rest, because all the rest is held inside this one fact. The troops had been mustered on the upper deck. They were in their nightshirts mostly, some of them barefoot. They had their muskets. The officers had their swords. The drummer beat for parade. The drummer was a boy. He beat for parade as he had been taught to do, and the men formed up to the drum as they had been taught to do, in ranks by regiment, with their officers at the front. They stood there. Seaton walked the line. He spoke to them. He spoke quietly. He said the boats could not take everyone, he said. The boats could take the women and the children. He said, if the men went for the boats would be swamped. He said, stand fast. He drew his sword as he said it. He drew it not because he doubted them, but because the order had to be seen as well as heard. He said it to the 74th. He said it to the 73rd. He said it to the 91st. He said it to the Lancers. He said it to the Marines. They stood. The boats pulled away. The ship was breaking. She had broken once already, just abaft the foremast, and the bow was sinking. The funnel had gone over the side and crushed the boat under it. The mainmast was tilting. Salmond was still on deck. He gave the last order, he said. Any man who could swim might try for the shore, but said also that any man who could swim should know there were sharks, and that the shore was 12 miles distant, and that the boats would not be able to take them in if they came near. He said it for the truth of it. He said, the men were free to take their chance. Most of them did not move. She broke fully then. She broke at the mainmast. The stern lifted. The bow was gone under. The men on the after deck were standing in a sloping line that ran from the broken edge down to the rail. They had their muskets still. They had not moved. They went under in formation as the stern went under, and the suction took them. And most of them did not come up. Some came up, some swam. Some were taken by sharks. Some reached the rocks and crawled out. Of those who reached the rocks, several died of exposure on the way to the lighthouse keeper's cottage at Danger Point, and several did not. It had been 25 minutes from when she struck. The boats lay off through the rest of the night. There were 3 of them. There were 90-odd women, children, and men in them. They could not pull for the shore because the shore was unknown and the surf along it was reported bad, and they had been told to wait for daylight. They waited. The sea was almost calm. The wind was light. The water around them was full of debris and of swimming men, and of men who were no longer swimming. The women in the boats did what they could. For the men in the water, who came near enough, they pulled some of them in. The boats could not take everyone. They took whom they could and held the rest off, because a swamped boat would have drowned everyone. The men in the water, who could not be taken into the boats, either struck out for the shore or held to wreckage or sank. Some of them sang. There is in the survivors' accounts a strange and persistent detail of singing. Not a recognizable hymn or anthem, just men in the water, keeping themselves company with their voices for as long as the voices held. There were sharks in the water. The sharks did what sharks do. The men in the boats heard it and could not help it and did not look. They looked, instead, at the sky, which was clear, and at the small fire of a star that hung very low over the African coast, which was the only direction they were sure of, and they waited for it to get light. The sun came up at 6 and showed the boats and the wreckage and a few bodies on the water and a strip of beach with men lying on it. The boats had stayed out of the surf during the night because the surf was bad. They came in at sunrise. They came in to find that some of the men they had not been able to take from the ship had reached the shore by their own strength and were alive and were lying on the beach. The boats brought in those they had saved. They went out again and brought in others who had floated on pieces of the ship, who had clung to wreckage, who had not been taken by sharks. The schooner Lioness came up later in the day and took the survivors aboard. They counted them. Of the 640 who had sailed, 193 were alive. The 9 women were alive. The 13 children were alive. They had got every one of them off in the boats. The colonel was not alive. Seaton had gone down with the men he had told to stand fast. The captain was not alive. Salmond had been killed earlier in the breaking, when the funnel came over. The boy drummer was alive. He had been put in one of the boats. He had not wanted to go. Some 40 or 50 of the men reached the shore by their own swimming, or by clinging to wreckage, or by holding to a horse. They came up onto an Africa they had never seen, and they walked, the ones who could walk, the long stretch of beach, toward the lighthouse, at Danger Point, which was the only building any of them had seen in the night. The lighthouse keeper there opened his door to them. He gave them what he had, what any keeper of that coast in that era would have had: a fire, hot water, a corner of the floor, the brandy from the cupboard. He sent word inland by whatever means were to hand. He kept the men in his cottage until the army came up the coast to find them. Some of those men did not live until the army came. Some of them did. The keeper, on the record, did not ask their names. He put them where there was room and gave them what he had. He had been one of the people the night had reached. That was enough. The women in the boats had watched, from a quarter of a mile off, the way the ship had gone over, and the way the line of men on the afterdeck had not. None of them, in the accounts that later reached the record, found a clean word for it. They said. They stood, and they said it in a flat voice, the way you say something you do not yet have the apparatus to take in. Most of them had been someone's wife. Some had been someone's daughter. They went on to the Cape and to England, and to other ships and other lives. And the night did not let go of them in the ordinary way. It went on with them. The husbands who had stood, the men who had not waved a second time, the bodies that were never sent home. These were not for the women who had been pulled away from them in the dark, behind them ever after. They had been on the Birkenhead. They went on, being on the Birkenhead for the rest of their lives. The thing got back to England in late April. The papers carried it. The Times carried it. There was an inquiry. The inquiry found that Solomon had hugged the coast too close, and that the boats had not been kept clear, and that the rock was uncharted and not his fault. The inquiry found also, in a paragraph that has since been read out at countless naval ceremonies, that the conduct of the troops had been of the highest order, and that the discipline of the regiments had saved the lives of every non-combatant on the ship. The Queen read the report. She wrote a letter to Seaton's widow. The widow kept it. The army made the Birkenhead one of the things it taught its young soldiers about, the way it taught them about Waterloo, the way it taught them about the squares at Quatre Bras. The Royal Navy set down, in its standing orders, a procedure that had not, until then, been a written procedure. In the abandoning of a sinking ship, the women and the children were to go first, and the men were to wait. They called it the Birkenhead drill. It went into Kipling's verse later. It went into the protocol of every passenger company that crossed the Atlantic. It went, too, into other places. The King of Prussia, who would later be Kaiser Wilhelm I, read the account. He had it translated into German. He had it read aloud to every regiment of his army. He did this so that his soldiers would know that there existed, in another country, men who had done such a thing, who, when their ship was sinking under them, had stood at attention while the women and the children were got away. He thought his army should know about it. The reading was an annual one in some regiments. It went on for 40 years. We are not, in our century, accustomed to thinking of an order as something a man can die obeying. We think of an order as a piece of paper. We think of it as something that gets argued over in offices, that gets revised, that gets quietly ignored when nobody is looking. We do not think of it as a thing you stand still for, on a deck that is tilting, while the water comes up the deck toward you, while the men in the boats pull away from you and do not look back. The men on the Birkenhead did. They had been told to. They had practiced standing under fire. They had practiced holding the line. They knew, when the moment came, that the line was the only thing that would save the boats. If they had broken, if even 30 of them had broken and rushed the boats would have capsized. The women would have drowned. The children would have drowned. They knew this. They knew it the way a soldier knows things he has been taught for years, without thinking about them anymore. So they stood. They stood with their bare feet on the iron deck and the cold water coming up the slope toward them, and they stood while the deck broke, and they stood on the part of the deck that was still there, and they went down with it. There were no banners. There was no music. There was a boy drummer crying because he was being put in a boat, and a colonel walking the line in his shirt sleeves, with a sword in his hand, and 445 men whose names mostly we do not now know, standing where they had been told to stand. That was the moment. That was all it was. And the protocol that saved every woman and every child on every passenger ship for the next 170 years was written in advance in the bodies of those men. They wrote it by not moving. That was how the writing was done. There is a small monument now at Danger Point. It has the names of the regiments on it. The 74th Highlanders, the 73rd Foot, the 91st Argylls, the 12th Lancers, the Royal Marines, the 2nd Queens, the 43rd Light Infantry, the 60th Rifles, the 6th Foot, and the Birkenhead's own crew. The monument is small. It does not need to be larger. The men who knew what had happened there did not need a large monument. The men who did not know what had happened there would not have read a large one anyway. The rock that took her is still down there. They marked it later. She is still down there. They have been over her more than once, in suits and with cameras. They have brought up some things. They have left most of it. It is a war grave. It is left. Every woman lived. Every child lived. The colonel went down with the men. The captain went down at his post. The boy drummer cried in his boat all the way to shore. He cried for the rest of his life, more or less, about it. He thought he should have stayed. He was a boy. That is the story. The men who stood in the line did not get to say anything about it because they did not come up. They had said it all by standing where they were. They had said it not in words, but in not moving. And that has turned out, in the end, to be the way that a particular kind of thing is said most clearly. Not in a speech, not in a letter, not in a memoir, but in a man being where he was told to be, and staying there while the sea came up the deck toward him. He was a boy. He should not have been on that ship. He was on it because the army had drummers, and the drummers were boys, and the army did not know yet that it would learn something terrible from him that night, about what an order could cost. He cried because he was alive. The men who had told him into the boat, Son had known what they were doing. They had paid for him to keep crying. That is the entire thing.